All right, as you know, here on Sunday night, our theme has been Be Not Deceived. They all begin with the letter S, and tonight the letter S stands for speaking in tongues. So be not deceived by speaking in tongues, all the false doctrines and heresies that are taught by or about tongues. So to begin with, turn your Bible to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. If you're going to talk about tongues, you've got to begin in Acts chapter 2, and there's a reason for that. Now, the first thing I want to talk about tonight concerning the gift of tongues is the definition of tongues, the definition. You know, there's a law of Bible study that is called the law of first mention, the law of first mention. And the law of first mention says that the way that something appears for the first time in the Bible fixes its definition for the rest of the Bible. Its first definition fixes its destination, or I should say its definition, from that time forward. Well, the first time men were given the gift of tongues was in Jerusalem in 33 A.D., and that event is recorded in Acts chapter 2. And what God says about tongues and the gift of tongues in Acts chapter 2 fixes the definition of tongues for the rest of the Bible. The tongues, the gift of tongues of the Bible, are the tongues of Acts chapter 2. If the tongues are not the same as Acts 2, they are not the true gift of tongues. Now, in Acts chapter 2, in verse 1, it says, "And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them, and they were all filled with the Holy Ghost, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together, and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born?" Now, according to verse 5, on the day of Pentecost, there was a great number of Jews and Gentile proselytes, gathered together in Jerusalem out of every nation under heaven. And because there were many nations and nationalities present that day, there were also many different languages spoken, many different languages, you can imagine. And so in order for all these men out of every nation to believe the gospel, they had to hear it preached in their own language. Therefore, right here, God gave the 12 apostles the gift of tongues, and according to verse 4, when they spoke in tongues, they spoke in the language of everyone present that day in Jerusalem out of every nation. See, verse 4 it says, they, that's the apostles, began to speak with other tongues. In verse 6 it says, every man heard them speak in his own language. One verse says tongues, the other verse says language. So in the Bible, when men spoke in tongues, they spoke in languages that could be interpreted and understood. And that's why the words tongues and languages are used interchangeably here in Acts 2, verse 4 and 6. And they're also used interchangeably in other parts of the Bible, other places in the Bible. You might want to write down Deuteronomy 28:49 with Jeremiah 5:15. God warned Israel that he would send a nation against them and that they would not understand the tongue of that nation. But the other verse says, which is a direct quote from the previous verse, said that God will send a nation against them whose language you will not understand. So the warning is the same. It's the same warning about a nation that God would send against them. But one says, you won't understand their tongue. The other says, you won't understand their language. They're used interchangeably, just like you find it in Acts chapter 2. So make no mistake about it. When the apostles spoke in tongues, they did not speak in this mindless gibberish and unintelligent babbling that you hear today. They spoke in foreign languages, and those languages were understood by men out of every nation under heaven. Think about that. Every nationality present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost heard the gospel preached in their own tongue or language. And that fixes the definition of tongues throughout the rest of the New Testament, and actually throughout the rest of the Bible. Tongues are languages, languages are tongues. The definition is fixed. The law of first mention says that the way that something appears for the first time in the Bible fixes its definition from that time forward. The first time that God ever gave men the gift of tongues was in Acts chapter 2, and when they spoke in tongues, they spoke in the language of many, many nations present that day in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Now turn your Bible this time to 1 Corinthians 12. 1 Corinthians 12, we're going to read verse 1, and we'll also read 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 1. And what I want to talk about now is what I call the acquisition of tongues. The acquisition of tongues. That is how men acquired the gift, how they received it. 1 Corinthians 12:1 says, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant. And then in chapter 14:1 it says, follow after charity and desire spiritual gifts. Now tongues, like the other signs and wonders, are called spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts. And all spiritual gifts, no matter what it was given to men freely by the Spirit of God. Those who had the gift of the Spirit, those who had the gifts the Spirit, like speaking in tongues, did not work themselves into an emotional frenzy to receive the gifts. They did not bring in a choir or a band and a song leader or a, quote, worship leader to whip up the crowd in a state of ecstasy to receive the gifts. And those who had the gifts did not pray and agonize at an altar for hours and days and weeks and months to receive the gifts. And those who had the gifts, like the gift of tongues, did not deny themselves food and water by fasting to receive the gifts. And they didn't cry and beg God for the gifts. If they had to do those things to acquire the gifts of the Spirit, they would not be gifts, nor would they be spiritual. They're called spiritual gifts for a reason. They're gifts because they were given freely. And they're spiritual because they were not obtained by carnal means. God just gave it to people as a free gift. Also, the apostles, who had the real genuine gifts, they did not spend years in language school to acquire the ability to speak in foreign languages. The gifts were given to them freely and miraculously by the grace of God and not by any works. Those who spoke in tongues did so without help, without aid, without education of any kind. And you know, isn't it strange that before these Pentecostal and charismatic missionaries who claim to have the gift of tongues, before they're sent to foreign countries, they spend years in language school learning the language of the people. And isn't it strange that when these Pentecostal and charismatic preachers preach in foreign countries, they all speak through a translator because they're unable to speak in the tongues of the people. They ain't do it. But the apostles, who had the real, genuine gift of tongues, they didn't spend 1 second in language school or require a translator either. Tongues was a gift, a spiritual gift. It was not acquired by work and agonizing. God just gave it to men freely as a gift. You know, one of the biggest jobs of a missionary, before he ever gets to the foreign fields today, he's got to spend years in language school. They may spend 2, 3, maybe even 4 years in language school before they're able to speak the language of the people they go to, no matter what the language is. Now, some people who are able to learn another language usually don't have much difficulty learning another language on top of that. I know the Filipinos speak English and the Philippine language. And the reason they speak English because it is taught in the public schools in the Philippines. It's a second language. And no matter where you go in the Philippines, you can hear the English language because it's taught in the public schools. And so because Filipinos can speak 2 languages, it seems like it's not so hard for them to go to another country and learn the language quickly because they're used to that. I know in South America, we support Gomer Indino. The language there is Portuguese. And that's a hard language to learn, I've been told. But these Filipinos, when they go down there, it don't take them long at all to learn the language because they're used to studying other languages. They learn English on top of the Philippine language, and so another language is not hard for them. But for people like me and you, especially me, to go into another country, I only know 1 language and have trouble with it, the English language. I'm like Billy Sunday, you know, if the English language, if it gets in my way, I'll step all over it. But those of us who speak English only and struggle with that, we have a difficulty going to another country, a foreign country, and learning the language. But with the apostles, they didn't spend 1 minute in language school. Boom, it was given to them automatically, immediately. And they did not preach to a translator. Didn't need one. Jimmy Swaggart, claimed for years he had the gift of tongues. And he'd get on radio and television, spat out this nonsense, and call that tongues. And yet, I saw him one time in Mexico preaching to a large crowd of people. Well, guess how he was doing it? Through a translator. I mean, here's a man said he had the gift of tongues. He gets to Mexico, he must have lost the gift because he's preaching through a translator. And that's true of all these Pentecostal and charismatic preachers. They all claim they got the gift, and yet when they go to Africa or wherever these other places they go to con people there, like they do here, they always speak through a translator. They're phony. They don't have the real gift of tongues. If they did, they'd be like the apostles. Now let's talk about the imperfections of tongues, the imperfections. The gift of tongues had disadvantages and imperfections that other spiritual gifts did not have. Other gifts were greater than tongues. Other gifts were greater than tongues. You know, of the gifts of the Spirit found in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, tongues is ranked last. Look at 1 Corinthians 12:28. 1 Corinthians 12:28. And God has set some of the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets. Thirdly, see, there's an order here, a rank. Thirdly, teachers. After that, miracles. Then, gifts of healing. Then, helps, government, diversities of tongues. Now you see where tongues lines up on in the list? Dead last. It ranks dead last. Also notice verse chapter 14. Chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. And look at verse 5. I would that you all spake with tongues, but rather that you prophesied, for greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh with tongues, except he interpret, that the church may receive edifying. And that verse Paul said, for greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh with tongues. It is strange then that how men seek the gift of tongues and not the other gifts that are far superior. That's not all. Tongues did not edify the church as the other sign gifts did. In 1 Corinthians 14:4, it says, he that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifieth himself, but he that prophesieth edifieth the church. Now you see that? Now you know the work of the ministry is called the edifying of the church, which is the body of Christ. That's the work of the ministry, is to edify the church. And the will of God is for the church to be edified. And without an interpreter, tongues could not edify the church, which means that those who spoke without an interpreter, they couldn't do the work of the ministry. The church was not edified by anyone who spoke in tongues without an interpreter. Didn't edify. Something else. Tongues did not exhort and comfort the saints as the other gifts did. In 1 Corinthians 14:3, it says, but he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. See, the man that prophesied, he's the one that edified, exhorted, and comforted the church, not the man that spoke in tongues. It's the one that prophesied. And also, according to 1 Corinthians 14, by the fact this whole chapter, Paul writing about the gift of tongues because it was a misused gift. It was also counterfeited by the devil. They're still doing that today. But according to 1 Corinthians 14, in this chapter, speaking in tongues without an interpreter, speaking in tongues did not edify the church, according to verse 5. Speaking in tongues without an interpreter was indistinguishable from noise. It sounded like noise. Verse 7. And speaking in tongues did not prepare the saints for the battle. Verse 8. If the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? So likewise ye, except you utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? For you shall speak into the air. Also, speaking in tongues without an interpreter was wasted time and words, according to verse 9. We just read it. You speak into the air if you speak without an interpreter. Well, what good is that? Also, speaking in tongues sounded barbaric to lost people. See verse 11? Therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me. A barbarian was considered somewhat ignorant. Also, speaking in tongues without an interpreter was unfruitful to the understanding, according to verse 14. In verse 14 he said, for if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prayeth, but my understanding is unfruitful. And speaking in tongues hindered lost people from getting saved. Verse 23, he said, if therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that you're all mad? But if all prophesy, and there come in one that believeth not, or one unlearned, he is convinced of all, he is judged of all, and thus are the secrets of his heart made manifest, and so falling down on his face, he will worship God and report that God is in you of a truth. Now you see what tongues did. To a lost man, hearing all that, he would say, these people are mad. They're going crazy. And speaking in tongues without an interpreter caused confusion in the church. Verse 33, it says, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. As a matter of fact, in 1 Corinthians 14:19, Paul said that a man who spoke just 5 words the church could understand, he was better than a man who spoke 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. Well, that breaks down to a ratio of about 2,000:1. In other words, if a man spoke just 1 word the church could understand, he was better than a man who spoke 2,000 words in an unknown tongue. So the disadvantages of the gift of tongues far outweighed the advantages. The gift of tongues was an imperfect gift with an interpreter and a useless gift without one. I say again, it was an imperfect gift even with an interpreter and a useless gift without one. And if you read 1 Corinthians 14 closely, you'll see that the majority of the statements that Paul makes about the gift of tongues are negative. Every statement in this, just about every statement he makes about tongues, the gift of tongues, is a negative statement. He said other tongues are much better, and he tells us all the disadvantages of tongues, speaking in tongues without an interpreter. And it's just verse after verse after verse, he shows us all the disadvantages, the negative things about the gift of tongues. And yet, that's the gift that people glorify the most. Now, the restriction of tongues, the restrictions. Now, at the same time that God gave the gift of tongues, he also placed a number of controls and restrictions upon the use of the gift. Those who had the gift of tongues were required to follow a strict set of guidelines when they exercised the gift. No other gift of the Spirit had as many restrictions as the gift of tongues. And those restrictions were necessary because of the widespread misuse of the gift and because Satan had counterfeited this particular gift. And we'll talk about that counterfeit next time. But notice the restrictions. 1 Corinthians 14, look at 27. If any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, at the most by 3, and that by course, and let one interpret. But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, let him speak to himself and to God. Verse 34, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Now, first of all, there was a restricted number who could speak in tongues. A restricted number as to who could speak in tongues. In verse 27 he said, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, or at the most by 3. So when God gave the gift of tongues, the most who could speak in tongues in any assembly was 3. And of course, if God said at the most by 3, you know it did not lead 4 or 5 or 10 to speak in tongues in any assembly. Why, if God led more than 3 men to speak in tongues in the assembly, he would have contradicted his own word. He says at the most by 3. So there's a restricted number. Secondly, there was a restriction as to when those 3, when they could speak in tongues. In verse 27 it says, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, at the most by 3, and that by course. by course. When men spoke in tongues, they spoke by course. That is, they spoke in an orderly manner, one following the other. In the assembly, the three men who were led to speak in tongues did not all speak at the same time. They spoke by course. The first man stood up, spoke in tongues, sat down. The second man stood up, spoke in tongues, sat down. Finally, the third man got up, spoke in tongues, sat down, and they were all that were allowed to speak in tongues in that assembly. That was it, just three, one following the other. Never at any time did God ever lead those three men to speak in tongues at the same time. It didn't happen. And then thirdly, there was a restriction upon who could speak in tongues. Who? There were two people who were expressly forbidden from speaking in tongues in the church. Number one, a man could not speak in tongues if he did not have an interpreter. Verse 28 says, "But if there be no interpreter, let him," the man, "let him keep silence in the church." So you see that under no circumstance was a man allowed to speak in tongues without somebody interpreting what he was saying. If he did not have an interpreter, he was commanded to keep silent. And then secondly, under no circumstances was a woman ever allowed to speak in tongues. In verse 34, God said, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." Now, when God said for the woman not to speak and keep silence in verse 34, there's no doubt whatsoever he's referring to speaking in tongues. Tongues is the subject of chapters 12, 13, and 14 of 1 Corinthians. In chapter 14 alone, the word tongues appears 15 times. 15 times the word appears. Therefore, when he said for a woman not to speak and to keep silence, that was a command for a woman not to speak in tongues. Under no circumstance was a woman ever allowed to speak in tongues in the assembly. God never gave a woman the gift to speak in tongues. You see, God Almighty foreknew that without controls and restrictions, the gift of tongues would be misused, counterfeited, and would lead to confusion and chaos in the church. And that's why God, in his infinite wisdom, placed these controls on the exercise of the gift, because the God of the Bible is a God of order and organization and not chaos and confusion. And the only way for the church to be edified was for these restrictions to be strictly enforced. Now, it appears from these controls that God put on the use of the gift that the church in Corinth was misusing the gift. That's why Paul says what he does. He says, number one, the most that can speak in any assembly is three. Evidently, the church at Corinth, more than three people were speaking in tongues. You got these churches today that claim to speak in tongues, and they all speak at the same time, 10, 20, and 30. Now, they're not real tongues. They think they are, but they all speak at the same time, 20 and 30 of them. And Paul said that when you speak in tongues, you do it in an orderly manner, one following the other. Well, evidently, they were not only three men or people speaking in tongues in the church at Corinth, but they were all speaking at the same time. They broke that regulation, that rule. And then Paul said, if any man in the church does not have an interpreter, be quiet. Evidently, men were speaking without interpreters. And he said, under no circumstance should a woman ever speak in tongues, and in the church, evidently, women were speaking what they thought were tongues. Got the same situation today, isn't it? These churches today that claim to speak in tongues, and they don't. Number one, more than three speak, 10, 20, and 50 speak. Number two, They don't take their time. They all speak at the same time. And number three, the men speak without interpreters. You know why? Because nobody can interpret that nonsense anyway. And the majority speaking are women. You know, I heard a Pentecostal preacher one time admit, he said if you take the women out of the Pentecostal church, it would fold up tomorrow. He actually said that. And he was a Pentecostal pastor. Because they're the ones that dominate this tongue-speaking deal in the Pentecostal charismatic church. And yet Paul says for the woman to be silent, not to speak in tongues. You know, if you just compare what you see today with what the Bible says, you'll see right off the bat that what we see is phony, is fake, it's a counterfeit. Tongues in the Bible were real, genuine foreign languages. This stuff you hear today is vain babbling. It's babbling. It's what Paul called it, I think, there in 2 Timothy chapter 2. He said, avoid vain babblings. I understand what he means now when he said that. And the tongues that the people speak today, they say that the way you gain the gift is by coming down to the old-time altar and praying and agonizing. And if you do it long enough, God will give you the gift. That's nonsense. The people who had the real thing, God gave it to them freely, without any effort on their own. And those who practice what they call the gift of tongue violate every control and restriction God put on the gift. How can something be of God if it violates all the commandments and restrictions and controls that he put on the use of the gift of tongues? Can't be of God. It's of Satan. Satan has counterfeited that gift. And these people sit in these churches and they hear this babbling and they say, look at here, these people got the gift of tongues. And they don't. It's just pure nonsense. And what a lot of them do, they're not aware of it, they're blaspheming and cursing God. And I can show you that, and we will here next time. But anyway, be not deceived by speaking in tongues. Be not deceived by the gift. Know what the gift is. It was a real, genuine gift. Men had the gift, and it was a wonderful gift. You know, I wished I had the gift, don't you? It'd be nice to have it. How many languages do you have right here in Coden Bible? English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Cambodian. Is there anybody I'm leaving out? That's 4 languages right there here in these little old towns spoken. So be nice if you had the gift to speak in all those languages. But you and I are struggling. Well, I'll just speak for myself. We struggle with the English language. I have no idea what these Vietnamese are saying. They might be making fun of us when we're around them. I have no idea what these Mexicans are saying. They're probably laughing at us in their own language. And the Cambodians, who in the world knows what they're saying? But anyway, you see from the Bible what the real, genuine gift is. All you got to do is, if you know what the real thing looks like, you know you can spot a phony right off the bat. It's just like the banks. They teach the teller to spot counterfeit money by showing them what real money looks like and feels like. Once you know what real money looks like and feels like, you can spot a counterfeit when you see it or feel it. Once you know what the real, genuine gift of tongues is, you can spot the counterfeit when you hear it and see it. And what we see today, totally counterfeit, because it bears no resemblance to the real thing.